Hi everyone, Courtney here, and in this video I am going to finally finish off this discussion of Hegel's preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. Sorry it took me a while, but it is 72 very dense paragraphs, and then I will move on to the first chapter as well, and in the end I'm going to answer some questions that I've gotten on my videos so far. Now before I do, you can add me on Instagram now at Courtney_Dolly_philosophy if you wish. Now moving on from where we left off, Hegel discusses the proposition, God is eternal. That's paragraph 23 in the preface. And what he says is that, well, he notes some interesting things about such a proposition. The first is that it's widely accepted that there is this need to represent the absolute as subject, right? Rather than something inanimate. So it's interesting that we use the word God, or that's a widely accepted way to refer to the eternal, rather than just talking about the eternal or being like as if it's something inanimate. And what this speaks to is Hegel's point that there is a conscious element to reality, or that consciousness is the indispensable quality of reality, right? Absolute idealism. There is no reality outside of consciousness for Hegel. So that's the first point, that there's this need to represent the absolute as subject. It speaks to something else too, but I'll get to it in a bit. The second thing that he points out is that God on its own is a meaningless word, right? Or a meaningless term. It doesn't convey anything meaningful, and that's understood. And so we have this anticipation that someone doesn't just say God, but that they're going to say God, and then they're going to add a predicate to create a sentence or a meaningful judgment, right? So what that speaks to, the fact that we can't just say God or eternal and think that we're communicating something meaningful to somebody else, for Hegel speaks to the point that the universal on its own is just the foundation for knowledge, but as he called it earlier, it's emptiness of cognition. It's not knowledge in any meaningful way, right? In other words, to have this concept of universality on its own is not the same as obtaining authentic knowledge about the world. So that's the second thing that he points out. The third thing that he points out about the statement, God is eternal, is that it's understood when you read this judgment that there is a conscious entity completely external to the sentence altogether. There is someone with knowledge of God who is making that claim. And what that speaks to for Hegel is that the only universal involved in claims to knowledge is that there's a conscious entity there to make a claim, like to perceive something. So basically, after this discussion, what he says that what follows is twofold. The first is that truth for Hegel exists only in terms of a scientific system of truth, because all of that shows that there was a big process that a conscious mind had to go through in order to make that claim, right? That God is eternal. So that's the first thing that he concludes, is that truth exists in terms of a scientific system of truth. And the second thing he concludes is that a basic proposition in philosophy is true, but also at the same time false, insofar as it can be easily refuted. So for instance, you could say God is eternal and the one thing there is. But on the other hand, you could say God is everything there is, or infinite things. And it might sound at first like these two statements are refuting each other, but for Hegel, that would mean that they were both true and false at the same time. And so to actually obtain true knowledge, we have to go beyond that. We have to be able to synthesize these claims and come up with a more unified understanding. So that's the second thing, is that a basic proposition in philosophy can be true and false at the same time for Hegel. So moving on from there, he basically says that all of this is contained within this word spirit that he uses, right? I think he says that all of this is contained in the representation which casts the absolute as spirit. So when he says spirit, he's referring to all of this, which is all included. And he goes on to explain that term in more detail. Now, I defined spirit in my last video, and the way that he starts to define it here in the 25th paragraph is a bit of a tongue twister, so I'll just pull out some main points. He says that spirit is actuality, or it is the essence, right? So again, it is the indispensable quality of reality. It is the progression of reality towards its final purpose, okay? So that's one thing. He refers to spirit as being in itself. And when he refers to being in itself, or that which is in itself, he's referring to the initial unreflective standpoint of consciousness, whereby it defines itself only an absolute other to everything else. So what does that mean? I'll give you an example. So I'm a mother, I had a baby, and my daughter was able to learn her name in like her first 2 weeks on the planet. Like, you know, you say her name and her eyes would just track directly to me. But months have gone by and there's no evidence that she understands any other words. She may not, but we don't really have evidence for that. And what this would speak to for Hegel, like in order for a newborn baby to actually learn their name so quickly would be that, look, the only thing that a baby immediately understands is its self-awareness of itself, right? It's an absolute otherness to everything else. Like there is me and then there's everything else. Or that initial concept, right? He calls it a knowledge in its universality, or the initial standpoint of consciousness. So that is being in itself, this unreflective standpoint of consciousness whereby it just understands itself as other to everything else. Now, he also mentions that spirit is also being for itself. That refers to a reflective standpoint of consciousness, whereby it has gone through a process of greater reflection and transcended beyond this, and is able to view itself not just completely other to everything else, but in a sense, in a unity with everything else. And so all of those are cast in his word spirit is what he's getting at. So those are some main points from that paragraph. Now he goes on to explain that spirit has gone through a long and laborious process just to get us to where we are at this stage, and he refers to previous points of spirit being like reduced to being like childhood as compared to where we are now in terms of our understanding. So the things that spirit or the conscious mind used to grapple with, we now have a better understanding, and again that speaks to his idea that there's this constant progression happening. And so he also talks about the fact that science and the conscious mind are necessary for one another. He continues to drive that point home where he says that at first it seems like they are the inverse of one another, but of course for Hegel they are both necessary for one another and to come to some understanding of the whole. He goes on to address mathematics, and he says that mathematics is also not the whole picture because it lacks sensory intuition, and so math on its own cannot explain the whole of reality. So basically his preface continues to drive home those points that subject and substance are one, and that to obtain knowledge we can't discard any of these. We also can't use any one of these tools or means for understanding ourselves on its own. So moving on to the introduction, Hegel immediately discards this whole idea of things in themselves. For Hegel, there is no thing in itself. You couldn't even speak about something like that for Hegel, because as soon as you would speak about it, it would no longer be a thing in itself, but mediated in some way. He uses the analogy of a bird being caught in a lime stick. In fact, if we were to try to say, well, maybe we could use an instrument to observe reality as it is when it's not being perceived. But again, that would be mediated by that instrument. Like if you were to set up a camera or something, it'd be mediated by the camera, and then again mediated by the way that we understand our reality. And so again, we would, like the bird caught in the lime stick, we would be in a trap. It would seem that we have attained knowledge of things in themselves when we really haven't. So from there, he moves on to the first chapter on sense certainty. And if you get nothing else out of this video or this discussion of this chapter, just understand that pure sensory experience on its own is not enough to obtain true knowledge for Hegel. And he provides many reasons for this in this first chapter on sense certainty, or at least in the first section, which is as far as I've gotten in this book. So in the first section, he discusses the nature of sensory experience, and basically what he says is that sense experience on its own, contrary to the empiricist view, is not enough to obtain knowledge, and he provides some reasons to support this. And I'm going to refer to my notes here so that I have them in order. The first reason he says is that the most that you could state based off a sensory experience is "it is." Okay, so all you could really assert just based on pure sense experience alone is being, or "it is." That's all you could say about something. So that it really isn't enough to say that we've obtained any kind of authentic or meaningful knowledge about something for Hegel. And that becomes clear when you just apply this to any material example, right? Like, you can't just say, something exists and then think that you've derived some kind of great scientific claim. So the second thing he says is that your senses do not immediately distinguish between one thing and another particular thing, right? So there's a process that the mind has to go through in order to distinguish between different things. And since it has to go through a process to do that, then knowledge can't come directly from experience. So I'll give you an example. A video camera, for instance, it gets some kind of input, right? Like it has a video and something appears to it in a sense, and yet we would never say that it has knowledge because it doesn't make any meaningful sense of it. So that's why philosophers like Hegel are saying that sense experience on its own is just not enough for knowledge, but the conscious mind is very important when it comes to our attainment of knowledge. Sorry if I'm talking a little fast, my phone is low on power. So the next thing he says is that evaluating truth is a problem, right, when it comes to evaluating the truth of claims. For instance, he gives the example of if you write down the statement, "now is nighttime," and he discusses, well, how are you supposed to evaluate the truth of that claim later on? Like, say you look at that claim later in the day, right? How are we going to evaluate the truth of that claim? Because it was said at a different time, it referred to a particular experience as opposed to the new time now in which we are evaluating the truth of it. So basically truth evaluation is a problem. So that was the example he gave, is now is nighttime. The fourth reason he gives that sense experience is not enough to obtain knowledge on its own is because there can be no immediate knowledge because everything is mediated. So we already kind of talked about that. And the fifth reason is language is vague and does not convey in full what we want to express. And so the fact that your mind has to play an active role to understand language and abstract concepts, right, shows that there is more involved in our attainment of knowledge. It's just more complicated than just having a direct sensory experience or sensory input and then having that knowledge directly available. And so basically, based on this messy nature of our sense experience, Hegel concludes that it is the conscious entity which is the essential reality. Whereas it first seemed that the object was the essential reality, Hegel effectively flips that to argue that it is the mind that is the essential reality or universal. For Hegel, the conscious mind is one with reality, and as soon as we would have knowledge of a thing in itself, it would be mediated in some way, so we can't even talk about that. But of course, for Hegel, it doesn't even exist anyway, because there's no reality outside of consciousness. Finally, Hegel does not see this subjective nature of reality as a problem. He attacks philosophers who have given up on trusting the senses altogether, or who have given up on trying to obtain knowledge at all, right? So he's not completely discarding sensory experience altogether, it's just that it's not the whole picture. And that is section 1 of the chapter on sense certainty. Okay, so we're at 12 minutes. I'll just go ahead and respond to some questions, excellent questions I've been getting on my channel about Hegel. The first is, Courtney, what is knowledge for Hegel? So I understand where he has said rather that knowledge exists in terms of a scientific system of truth, and that the only universal involved in the attainment of knowledge is the pure I in general, and that it's this rigorous process that we go through. And I've seen online people say that knowledge for Hegel is the pursuit of philosophy. However, I would prefer to do a video on that once I am actually done the book, because I just want to be really clear on all of the nuances. Like, for instance, he's already distinguished between immediate knowledge versus like authentic knowledge, so I can do a video on that when I'm actually done the book. Another question, Courtney, what is a Hegelian universal, and how would you compare this to what Kant said about the capacities? Like, would you say that a universal is like a Kantian capacity? Like, what is it? I've been thinking about this since you asked, and it's such an excellent question. Perhaps you could argue that it's like a Kantian capacity of the mind. Now, for Kant, the capacities of the mind are the most fundamental things that the mind is capable of doing. And of course, they don't just passively receive information, but for Kant, they actually actively contribute to the way that we understand our world. So for instance, with Kant, the capacity of sensibility, or the capacity of the mind to obtain to have sensory experiences, contributed, I think, space and time, or like the capacity of the understanding contributed, concepts. And so So it's possible that the universal is like a Kantian capacity. It's also possible maybe that it's like something that the mind contributes, like similar to a Kantian like concept, or so maybe it's like that, something the mind actively like outputs. But anyway, that's just another theory that I have is as an updated answer to your question. But yeah, definitely excellent questions from you guys. Another question I got is, Courtney, what is an idea for Hegel, capital I? So I googled this actually because he mentions it in the preface without really giving it much context. Idea, capital I, apparently refers to the synthesis of the practical idea and the theoretical idea, which I'm sure will become more clear to me as I read on. But if I was going to put this in lay terms, it seems like an idea, capital I, is like a piece of knowledge without being like the actual whole of knowledge whereby spirit comes to understand itself. But that's just my working theory. I'm literally on chapter 1, so don't take my word for it. And I know that a lot of you are probably wondering, like, why can't you answer this at the drop of a hat if you have your degree in philosophy? And the answer is that I'm pretty sure, if I recall correctly, no one would have ever sat me down and said, you know, this is what Hegel believes knowledge is, but rather a professor would probably say something more like, what do you think that Hegel means by knowledge, and can you provide supporting evidence in quotes to support your claim? And that would be more like the way getting a degree is, right? Like, you know, you wouldn't ask like a lawyer, not that like this is on the same level, but I'm just saying, like, you wouldn't ask a lawyer, like, you know, how come you can't answer what the outcome of this trial is going to be, you know, based on what you've seen, right? Like, it's kind of a similar thing. It's not always necessarily about, at least I think, it's not always necessarily about having a 100% perfect answer, but it's always, there's always going to be some kind of interpretation involved, especially at the BA level. You know, maybe if I was a professor, I would be able to answer these things like really well for you guys. So all this to say that your responses are as good as, and often way better than mine are. So yeah, thank you for commenting. It's always super helpful for me to help me understand the book as well. So that was the other thing. So what else have I been asked? Oh, to the commenter who discussed string theory. I read your comment and I really do want to respond in full. I don't have a science background, so it was a little complicated for me to understand, but I got the gist that string theory supports what Hegel is saying, that consciousness is the fundamental aspect of reality, and I look forward to responding in full when I have a chance. I believe it was the same commenter who asked about my Instagram, so yes, I now have Instagram, Courtney_Dolly_philosophy. I'm trying to think if there were any other questions that I need to respond to, but yeah, I think those were the main questions I've gotten so far. So thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I love when you guys comment, and I love when you you know, really dive in deep to the text and ask me those complicated questions. So thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to posting again as soon as I can.